זו פרופסור נאדège רגרו, והיא היסטוריונית, a historian ו-research professor at Sciences Po בפריז. Formerly, she was in Columbia University, a visiting scholar at the University of Oxford. Her research centers on historiography of the Holocaust in Southeast Europe, as well as on the transnational history of trials of war crimes. She's currently working on a project on trials of anti-Jewish crimes in end-of-war Bulgaria. And this is the topic she will be dealing with today. I just add that her latest publications include Bulgaria, the Jews, and the Holocaust, which is exactly what we are doing, on the origins of a heroic narrative. And she indeed will be speaking about the role of the immediate post-war trials in Bulgaria in documenting the fate of Bulgarian Jews, and she's pointing out another source, important source. Please, the floor is yours for the next 20 minutes.
Well, thank you very much for your introduction. Thank you very much to Jackie Comforty and for the organizers of the conference at Yad Vashem. As you know, we are living a very difficult moment in terms of the attitudes of public authorities in Bulgaria towards history. You're organizing a very important Yad Vashem. We are preparing, in collaboration with Yad Vashem, actually in dialogue at the Memorial de la Shoah, a conference that will take place on June 25 that will try to address similar issues of how we write history and how history is being used. So today I would like to tell you about the end-of-war trials in Bulgaria. This morning, Stephen Sage reminded us that it was amongst the earliest in Europe, indeed, and a very important and complicated case. Because of computer problems, I will not be able to show you the slides, so I'll have to say next slide all the time, which may be slightly unpleasant. But the point of this presentation is actually to show you the ambivalence and the complexity of a situation in which trials are major sources for the investigation into the committing of facts during World War II. And at the same time, because we are dealing with after regime change and the early establishment of a communist regime, we are also scrutinizing the emergence of a dominant narrative, the narrative of, quote unquote, the rescue of the Bulgarian Jews that has sidelined the responsibility of Bulgarian authorities and the import of the deportation of Jews from occupied territories. So I will try to keep those two facets together. So next slide, I would like to start. Next slide, if you can hear me. Can you hear me? Can you move the slides?
Okay. We hear you, but we don't see the slides. Please go on.
Okay. So if you do not see, do you see the slide? Okay. So I will be actually reading this. It's a part of the requisitory speech of prosecutor Manjur Rachamimov, who was one of those who investigated the cases. And what he said right when he was giving a speech is something very important that reminds us of the fact that actually there was a great awareness of the importance of thinking about the future when the trial was held. For the first time in history, the government adopts a special text, thanks to which those who wrote and implemented racist legislation are declared criminals and stand to be prosecuted and sanctioned by the People's Court. But what is even much more moving is the awareness that this goes much beyond Bulgaria and that in several decades, in several hundred years from now, historians, scholars, and philosophers from all over the world will come to Bulgaria as they do today They will flip the little pages of the present trial and will examine every sentence, every word, and every single sign to discover the historical truth of our bloody and terrible epoch. And when I started doing that 10 years ago, my hands were shaking in front of those pages that were actually helping us discover elements which were of extreme importance and very painful. So next slide, we're going to start with some context and some background regarding the creation of the People's Court. Indeed, the People's Court was set up based on a decree law that was passed on October 6th. That was done right after the reversal of the quote-unquote fascist regime in Bulgaria with the invasion by the Soviet army, and with the idea that it might be possible, next slide, to actually do many things at the same time. What you see on the left is the visuals in Evreiski Vesti of what the future was supposed to look like, crossing the vast. What you see to the right-hand side is a visual of the Palace of Justice in its majesty, the way it had been built in the interwar era. So next slide, we're going to see now what the purpose was of the creation of the People's Court. It was, as you see, quite ambivalent. On the one hand, there was the idea of prosecuting war crimes against the Allies, against the partisans, against the occupied population. And at the same time, there was the idea that this should allow to do away with the former quote-unquote bourgeois elites and to prepare a revolution in Bulgaria. As you know, the People's Court have been rightfully deemed to be highly politicized. And in the case of the general trial, trial 1 and 2, next slide, there were quite a number. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, quite a number of ways of assessing who was guilty, a very harsh set of sentences, and quite few attention being dedicated to the persecution of Jews. Mostly it was economic crimes in Article 5, linked to notions of bribes and theft that were not specific for the Jews. The chief prosecutor, in his final speech, emphasized the fate of the Jews a little bit more. And in quite a number of the elements of the verdict, there were references to the persecution of Jews. However, those politicians who, despite belonging to the former regime, had tried to fight to help defend Jews, also received heavy sentences. So the question is, why was it decided in the end to create a unique, exceptional, specific, specialized jurisdiction? That decision was made in November 1944 in order to see to the reckoning with crimes against Jews. Next slide. What you see here again, Evreiski Vesti, we are changing roles, and you see something very important. The advocacy by communist Jews in Bulgaria that kept on publishing documents. Here, the Belev-Daneker agreement, and also a picture about deportation from Skopje. So there was intense commitment on the part of the communist Jews to see that justice would be done. But why should the Communist Party have paid much attention to this? We do not have an answer, but an hypothesis. Next slide. The hypothesis was given at the moment, so this is when the Commissariat for Jewish Affairs, when the consistory decided to ask that the crimes against Jews should be prosecuted, and so they turned to Petrov, and they really wanted this to happen. Next slide will be why it did happen. We see that when we listen to Jacques Nathan, who was a communist, a propaganda, who kind of explained, if we want to be presented as a democratic country at the moment when people are deciding the fate of vanquished Bulgaria, the former ally of the Nazi, so when the destinies of our countries are decided, we must demonstrate that the anti-Semites are judged. and that there are no anti-Semites in the democratic circle of the Bulgarian people. So the key idea was that it would be possible to use the trial in order to make sure that Bulgaria would not be accused of having been anti-Semite. So what actually happened? Next slide. There were only two qualifications. The trial itself was to some extent a failure. One of them was the active and substantial contribution to the persecution of Jews. The other one was personal enrichment and that of others. The legal personnel was a mixture of professional and non-professionals, the non-professionals being communist militants. The number of defendants were actually quite limited. 64 accused, only 52 stood trial. Most of them were from the Commissariat for Jewish Affairs. The verdict was nearly surreal. While Chambers 1 and 2 had condemned to death a large number of parliamentarians, ministers, regents, councillors, here you had 19 acquittals and the sentences, but for a few people who were already either dead or absent were rather limited. Nonetheless, next slide, and that is where it becomes totally fascinating, it's documented facts. What you see is the small room 11, where the trial took place in the gigantic palace of justice in Sofia. I would like you to give you only 3 examples. How deportations were documented, how the expulsions from Sofia were understood at the time, and questions of economic expropriation. So let us start with deportations. Next slide. Deportations, on the one hand, were supposed to be minimized. As I told you before, the purpose was to show that the great majority of the people, and that is the narrative you hear until today, was not committed in any way to any form of persecution against Jews. So there had to be a speech about collective innocence. At the same time, documents were gathered that showed responsibility of the Bulgarian authorities in the deportation. Next slide. Here we see prosecutor Boris Barov, and he very clearly stated that he had 2 questions. Were the deportations from Bulgaria and Macedonia imposed by Germany in an imperative and compelling way, or were there ways of doing out of this? And what was the position of King Boris? In his final response, he asserted the guilt of the king, but only a fascist clique, tiny group of people who were totally foreign to the life of the large popular masses. The court judgment was even more stringent, more clear in its negation. The anti-Semitic persecutions at home were not the work of the Bulgarian people, but only a handful of bureaucrats. The act of deportation was German more than Bulgarian. And yet, even Boris Barov, when he was arguing, said Bulgarian fascist government proved more servile on the Jewish question than the other satellite of German Hitlerism. And like Professor Michman said a few minutes ago, indeed, everybody was looking at everybody, and only a comparative analysis, and we'll talk about this tomorrow too, can help us understand what happened. Next slide. As a matter of fact, there were many testimonies, including of Jewish voices, of people who had survived the deportation, as well as Bulgarian officials working in the occupied territories, for the central bank, for the police, or for the local administration. I insist on the importance of those Jewish testimonies because they took place a year and a half after the events. So we're really talking about things which are contemporaneous with the fact themselves. There was an enormous amount of archival documents. Some of them had been gathered by Nathan Greenberg, who also came to testify. We talked about his extremely important book, Documenti, published in 1945. And there were documents, they were about the organization of the deportations, the arrest, the transfers, the detention, the deportation themselves. So it's an enormous amount of data. In addition to that, they at the time had an excerpt from diaries, including from Prime Minister Bogdan Filov. And there was a unique testimony, I do not know whether you're familiar with this, by Menachem Isaac Cohen, who had survived Auschwitz. I translated his testimony into French, and it was published by the French Revue d'Histoire de la Shoah. It's an extremely moving testimony, a very important one because it had a strong impact also on the audience in Sofia. And the next witness who came to talk right after him said, well, now that I've heard his voice, I don't know how to speak. I don't know what to say. How could I ever complain about what happened? Because, you know, we've heard him, and we know how atrocious the Holocaust was. Nonetheless, things were said. Next page. Persiano Haramimov was a physician. He had been deployed to Xanthi in Greece, and he was arrested despite being a Bulgarian Jew. We have this morning quite a number of references to the idea that saying that the Bulgarian Jews were saved is not fully accurate, to say the least. And he explained and described on March 4th, 1943, it was a date that inflicted on me a heavy psychological trauma from which I still cannot recover. I will not read everything, but I will insist on one sentence. In front of me stands the director of the motorized police, Mr. Monchlov, who informs me of the government's decision to expel all Jews from Belomorye to the interior of the kingdom. I told him that I reside here as a citizen mobilized doctor and that I come from the old borders of the kingdom. He said, it doesn't matter. All of them without exception. So one first important statement about the fact that Bulgarian Jews at times too were arrested, transferred, interned, and then afterwards he was freed. Next slide. There are also some testimonies by police officers like Boris Bozukov, who tell about the violence, the brutality, especially against women. Surprisingly, in the very few books, and Professor Milchman was right, up to today, the best monography available is that of Frederick Sherry that was published 50 years ago. I'm talking about the fact. There have been archives published, and they are very important. There have been books like mine trying to think about the building of knowledge. But with regard to the facts, we still lag behind. And in particular, gender perspective is off. And so here we see that women were searched, but not simply searched. They were searched in the internal part of their body. And there was the beating up of people who were supposed to be rich. The next testimony is even more striking. Next slide. Is a pre-trial statement by a nurse, Rosa Yakova, who managed to get the Demir Hisar Castro transit point in Greece, where women of child of particular brutal Bulgarian CAF delegate was sent. And she talks about the children, the old people, the mothers, and all of those who were helpless, naked and barefoot. She talks about violence against women and how police officers were trying to push people, to kick them, to grasp women's breasts, and to push them into the cars. As you know, there were 2 transit points, and people had to wait for many hours in the cold, in suffering, and also in this extreme verbal and physical brutality. So now we know there were Bulgarians who were arrested and deported. There are Jewish testimonies that were collected at the time, and there were even Bulgarians who tried to denounce the facts. Next moment, let us see now what happened with the expulsion from Sofia. As you know, some people still maintain that the expulsion was supposed to protect Bulgarians from deportation. And indeed, for people who work on other countries, they might be surprised. Why disperse Jews when in most countries they were concentrated? In the view of Belaf, the Commissariat for Jewish Affairs, the idea is that if you disperse Jews, mostly in the northern part of the country, there would be less ability to get mobilized and to prevent the deportation of most, if not all, Bulgarian Jews. But this is not only visible in his own reports and archives, it's also visible in the testimonies we have during the trial. Next slide. In Sofia, so there were about 25,000 Jews, about 19,153 were deported within 2 weeks. They were asked, and that is often forgotten, to draw a list, an inventory of what they had in their shops, to take the key to their home and to bring all of that to the Commissariat for Jewish Affairs or to leave it with a trustee. They were given 3 days to do that. You can imagine the degree of panic and the fact that it was so majorly difficult to get all the data about what they had in 3 days. Next slide.
Professor Ragaru, I hate to be a pest, I really hate.
Yes, this only 5 minutes and not even. So there is here a statement by a lawyer who explains, towards the end of May, police trucks were on the move. And it took the Jews and somewhere, we did not know where, they in fact were sent to a concentration camp in Solvit, but we assumed that they had been sent to Poland, as they, the government, had done in March with the Jews from the Belomorje. So the idea that being deported was a help is something that was not believed at the time and definitely cannot believe today. The last point before I conclude has to do with economic appropriation of Jewish properties. Next slide. So, next slide. It was a central component. There is the book by Ruben Avramov. At the time of the trial, there were 15 people being accused. It was mostly focused on Sofia and on modest boutiques and shops. And the charges actually did not fully succeed because they were prosecuting crimes at the expense of the state rather than at the expense of the Jews. So here again, the sentences were poor. But the demonstrations by people who testified were important. Next slide. One of them is by Samuel Panigel that helps us understand the role of multiple institutions. The Bulgarian National Band, the police, local agents. It was not done only by the Commissariat. And here, I have no time to read, but he was beaten up in an extremely ruthless fashion for 5 to 7 days, being extremely poor, tortured until the moment when he actually found money through the Jewish community and gave that was supposed to be given for the poor in the city of Schumann because he could not endure the extreme violence that was being done against him. Last testimony before I conclude. Next slide. Here, this is even, in a way, solely atrocious because it shows you the kind of vulgar, atrocious tricks that were used by liquidators. Liquidators were mostly lawyers. As you may know, on March 9, in Sofia, there was a conference dedicated to the role of lawyers in rescuing Jews. Some did, others did not. And for this lady who came to talk about her shop, she had to leave so fast that she could not exactly know what was left. And so they keep on asking her questions, but who liquidated? She doesn't know. But what was there? She doesn't know. And actually the liquidator has been arguing that, yeah, maybe since there's a page, the sugar was gone, it's because of mice. And so they turned to her and said, but did you have mice? And she said, well, no, at the time when I left, there was no mice. Can you imagine what it means to be coming and talking to the court and have people pretend that you've lost all you owned because mice suddenly appeared in your shop? So to conclude, next slide. If we try to consider the trial, the first thought, to the right you see the French version of my book and the Bulgarian version of the book that was had a quite strong impact on discussion in last fall. The very chamber 7, that was created to demonstrate the uniqueness of Jewish wartime predicament, ended up creating the rescue narrative. Yet, the pre-trial investigations and the court sessions were crucial to our understanding of anti-Jewish policies, and Frederick Cherry massively cites them. And third, if we want to move forward, because indeed it's only the inception of doing research on the facts. We do need to use transnational history of justice. I tried to do that comparing Bulgarian and German trials. We have to do much more in order to have this integrated history of the Holocaust that will allow us to show facts and also to oppose political uses of the past. Thank you very much for your attention.
Professor Ragaru, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this detailed account and of this contrast that you can hardly stand between what was done and between the results of the trials. And thank you for pointing at this important source that should be integrated, really, has not been integrated yet in the research. And thank you for the work that you are doing. Thank you again.